Under the brilliant light of war, all we see is the darkness of war, a fierce painting drawn from the fragments of hope. From ambitious aspirations, and from countless shattered souls. Every time bombs and bullets rain down, it's like a painful blow to the loving, peace-seeking hearts of the world's people. Alongside the thunderous explosions, the funds poured into each battle flow like an endless torrent, not stopping at just billions of dollars. It's also an economic resource and a series of development opportunities lost when national budgets run dry, people become impoverished, and political instability reigns, causing even the world's top superpowers to falter. So, beyond the two world wars, which wars are considered the most costly and expensive to this day? The war in Vietnam, where the United States, the world's #1 superpower, wielded economic and military might that no other nation dared to challenge. However, for the first time in their proud history, with 5 presidents, 4 war strategies, and trained dozens generals were sent, they still couldn't conquer an entire nation. The Vietnam War saw nearly 60,000 American soldiers laid to rest, and over 305,000 had to bear the scars of wounds, making this the most horrendously costly war for the US since World War II. Turning back over 50 years ago, on March 8, 1965, the first waves of US Marines landed on the shores from Phu Loc to Xuan Thio in great numbers. They officially launched the invasion of Vietnam, seeking to rescue the Republic of Vietnam's army, which was hanging by a thread. In just about 10 years following, the US dropped approximately 7.6 million tons of bombs on the S-shaped land, including Laos and Cambodia. This was nearly 3 times the total amount dropped in the entirety of World War II. Not only that, but the US also sprayed herbicide on 20% of the southern Vietnamese land, destroying agricultural land and wreaking havoc on the health of local populations for generations. Just considering the bombing campaigns in northern Vietnam, Washington spent about $900 million at that time. During the peak period, there were over 500,000 American troops stationed on the battlefield in Vietnam. Not to mention the technical teams, logistical support, and naval fleet stationed day and night off the coast. Supplying this force incurred colossal operational costs for weaponry, food, fuel, and essential supplies. And it didn't stop there. It wasn't just about sustaining the mainland troops. Each year the United States had to spend an enormous amount to support the Saigon government's regular army. It must be emphasized that at that time, a soldier in the Saigon army's ranks was equipped no differently than an American soldier, and could even support an entire family. However, continuous investments without significant returns gradually led the US to sink into a quagmire here. To meet the constant demands from the feudal war efforts, consumer goods factories in the US were converted to produce military equipment, causing a decline in goods and harming the economy. The deficit in war costs severely deepened the budgetary crisis, contributing to the gloomy recession of the US economy in the 1970s. The exorbitant costs even led the US to continuously print money to sustain military power, inadvertently contributing to the devaluation of the USD and increased inflation, leading to the collapse of the Bretton Woods system, the fixed exchange rate system established by the US Central Bank for the USD. Unemployment, poverty, and conscription force divisions between the US government and the people. A series of protests and strikes erupted. Estimates show that the US spent $676 billion on the Vietnam War, adjusted to the value of $2004. Without accounting for other associated expenses, this level of loss only stood behind the cost of the US in World War II and exceeded even the cost of the US in World War I. Another calculation shows that the US government had to spend $950 billion according to exchange rate 2011 prices. If you include the costs of supporting veterans after the war, the US spent a staggering $1.2 to $1.8 trillion on the Vietnam War. It's worth emphasizing that this is over $1.2 trillion as according to exchange rate 2011 prices. For this reason, for over 20 years thereafter, the United States of America and Stripes hardly conducted any major military campaigns, but rather floundered in the turmoil it created itself. Besides the physical casualties, about 700,000 out of 2.7 million U.S. soldiers who served in Vietnam suffered from various forms of psychological disorders, commonly known as Vietnam Syndrome. In addition, around 10% of returning American soldiers became drug addicts during their days of combat far from home, leading to 70,000 to 300,000 American veterans committing suicide after returning from Vietnam, affecting generations. Many years after the war, hundreds of thousands of American soldiers and advisors were afflicted with cancer or had children with birth defects due to exposure to Agent Orange. After the failure in the S-shaped land, President Richard Nixon reflected that never before in American history had so many resources been used so ineffectively as in the Vietnam War. Ultimately, even a superpower armed with a nuclear arsenal with a total national output in the hundreds of billions of dollars couldn't secure a victory against a small nation. Although they never admitted defeat, to this day, the Vietnam War is still considered a crucial turning point in American history, a period after World War II taught in almost every military school in the land of America. In summary, General Maxwell D. Taylor, Special Advisor to President Johnson and former commander of U.S. forces in Vietnam, succinctly put it, "We all had a part in America's failure in Vietnam, and there was nothing good about it. There were no heroes in this war, only fools. And I was one of them." In the early 2000s, still under the influence of the United States but through their NATO allies, the final days on the battleground of Yugoslavia were marked by escalating ethnic political tensions. The man at the center of it all was Slobodan Milosevic, the leader of Serbia during this period. He implemented a series of measures to restrict the autonomy of Kosovo, leading to an escalation of conflicts into a full-blown war, where Kosovo's forces engaged in military campaigns against Serbia. The war only came to an end when NATO, in support of the Kosovo Albanians, launched an air campaign that lasted for 78 continuous days. NATO used aircraft to target military objectives and civilian infrastructure in Serbia, part of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. The campaign was seen as a severe punitive strike from the West against a stubborn leader unwilling to address his internal issues. Additionally, NATO's bombing campaign in the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia was one of the most costly military campaigns since World War II. During this time, NATO forces dropped over 23,000 bombs, resulting in the destruction of half of the economic production capacity in the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. Modern combat aircraft like F-16, F-15, Mirage 2000, Harrier, along with various others, were utilized. This was combined with the deployment of Tomahawk cruise missiles produced by the United States and Scalp missiles from the French military to target both military and civilian infrastructure in Serbia. According to officials from Yugoslavia, the NATO air campaign resulted in over 1,700 civilian casualties, over 10,000 severely wounded, and nearly $30 billion in losses. However, experts suggest that the total damage to industrial facilities, transportation, and civilian infrastructure on the Yugoslav side ranged from 60 to 100 billion US dollars. In total, the NATO military coalition conducted 35,000 attack sorties, launching approximately 550 cruise missiles along with 23,000 bombs and artillery shells. About 35% of these were highly accurate guided munitions. According to both BBC reporters and various military analysts from the UK-based company Janes, the total cost for the NATO military coalition in this campaign was around 43 billion US dollars. This included deploying military personnel from member states, conducting numerous airstrikes, providing military equipment, as well as a range of post-war activities such as infrastructure reconstruction and resettlement support in Kosovo. The Kosovo War lasted until June 1999, when Serbia finally accepted a ceasefire agreement with NATO. Subsequently, both UN and NATO forces entered Kosovo to establish a secure area and assist in reconstruction and reconciliation efforts. Kosovo has since been administered by the United Nations in the post-conflict period. This war marked a new political doctrine for the West, emphasizing the use of force to resolve issues. The US also leveraged this conflict to assert its leadership role in Europe, especially in the context of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, where former Eastern Bloc allies were beginning to seek more independent policies from their big brother across the Atlantic. The Kosovo War was also the first step for the US in turning NATO into an organization with global influence, capable of independently executing security missions worldwide, all while considering the benefits to Washington first. Moving to Asia, it was a clandestine confrontation between the two superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States. On June 25, 1950, North Korean forces, with support from the Soviet Union, crossed the 38th parallel, initiating a large-scale offensive across the entire Korean peninsula to unify the region. With high combat spirit, good discipline, and abundant weapon support from the Soviet Union and China, North Korean forces quickly pushed back South Korean troops and made them in an extremely difficult situation. Just when the Koreans believed they were on the verge of reunification, the US intervened. At that time, with the Soviet Union boycotting the United Nations Security Council, this organization immediately passed a resolution to support and provide military aid to South Korea. United Nations forces, predominantly commanded by the US, were quickly deployed to push back North Korean and Chinese forces. A massive amount of weaponry and war materiel was mobilized, including even battleships from World War II for fire support. This was not just a war, but also a clash between two worlds, two ideologies, a competition of influence between the two superpowers of that era. It erupted like an unexpected storm, sweeping away all hopes for peace and sowing the seeds of pain and loss. One of the largest battles in this field was the Battle of Daegu. The United Nations coalition forces conducted an amphibious landing operation with hundreds of B-29 planes and thousands of large bombs. In total, the US dropped 635,000 tons of bombs, including 32,000 tons of napalm, on the Korean peninsula. This was more than the total amount of bombs dropped by the US in the entire Pacific theater throughout World War II. It nearly obliterated urban centers in North Korea. This war was not just an armed conflict, it resulted in immeasurable suffering that cannot be quantified by statistics. Countless families torn apart, innocent people caught in a brutal whirlwind. Brothers of the same bloodline had to face each other on opposite sides of the front lines, painting a poignant and contrasting picture. In addition, both airstrikes and bombings caused serious damage to the infrastructure of both sides. Infrastructure like bridges, manufacturing facilities, and transportation systems were destroyed or severely weakened, hindering post-war economic recovery. It also had severe psychological and social consequences, creating divisions not only in territory but also in the ideals of the fighters, generating immense pain for an entire nation. After pouring both troops and billions of dollars to support South Korean forces in regaining the advantage, the US established a series of bases in South Korea, paving the way for the country's development into an Asian powerhouse. On the other side of the border, although there was some initial progress due to possessing a heavy industrial base, North Korea later pursued nuclear weapons, resulting in a series of sanctions and leading to a secluded North Korea. Nearly half a century after the Korean War concluded, the collapse of these two towers also marked the moment when the hearts of the American people crumbled. Over 3,000 lives lost, 6,000 injured. These were the results of a simultaneous attack on the World Trade Center in New York and the U.S. Department of Justice in Washington by 19 organized terrorists belonging to Al-Qaeda. It sent shockwaves worldwide, profoundly impacting the foreign policy that the U.S. had built. This attack is considered a significant milestone, signaling the explosion of the global war on terror. U.S. President George W. Bush immediately launched the Perpetual War on Terror, a series of campaigns aimed at combating global terrorism in numerous countries around the world. From Afghanistan and Iraq to the Philippines, Somalia, Pakistan, Yemen, all the way to Indonesia. Among these, the conflict in Afghanistan consumed hundreds of billions of US dollars, covering expenses for military deployment, infrastructure development, political and military support for the Afghan government, and various related activities. This posed a significant financial burden on the U.S. national budget. The estimated total cost of this war from 2001 to 2010 skyrocketed to $1.147 trillion when adjusted for inflation. The U.S. struggled to establish a stable, reliable government in Afghanistan. Failures in political support and societal development created a conducive environment for terrorist groups to thrive and for the Taliban to regain control. According to a report from the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs at Brown University, the total cost of this war ranges from $4 to $6 trillion. Therefore, the U.S. war on terror is the most expensive in American history. During World War II, the U.S. spent only $3 trillion, adjusted for today's inflation. Beyond the financial toll, this U.S.-led war also resulted in the loss of thousands of lives, both military and civilian, and left tens of thousands of other soldiers injured. Furthermore, it's challenging to categorize the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan as unqualified successes. Presently, Iraq grapples with sectarian violence alongside the proliferation of self-proclaimed military organizations. Meanwhile, in Afghanistan, the Taliban insurgency has regained control after NATO and the US withdrew their forces. Up to this day, numerous costly conflicts persist, prompting us to question whether all this bloodshed and suffering is warranted, whether the colossal financial investments have been worth it, and whether the thousands of lives lost were in vain. Wars of this magnitude have permanently altered the global landscape. They rob humanity of the right to life, the right to freedom, cherished by countless hearts yearning for peace. They become showcases of power for the world's leading superpowers. Ultimately, it is hoped that the world will collectively reflect on what has been lost and the bitter lessons from wars gone by. If we can look towards a future where humans not only preserve peace but also aspire to values that are authentic and humane, that would be a monumental achievement.
Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like and share this video. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our videos and much more. Click on the screen to watch another thrilling video. Thank you for joining us. See you in the next one. Take care.